It starts with a sentence that doesn't sound dangerous at all, but what if it is? What if the biggest spiritual risk in your life isn't something dramatic, not something you'd even notice, but something so ordinary that millions of people ignore it every single week and never realize what it's costing them until it's too late? Because according to Father Dan Reehil, the line between salvation and separation from God isn't always marked by obvious evil. Sometimes it's marked by quiet neglect, and that's where the real danger begins. You'd expect a warning about your soul to come wrapped in fire and fear, but instead it shows up in something deceptively simple: a missed mass, a delayed confession, a slow drift away from the very things that once anchored your life. And here's the part that should make you pause, because it's not just about what you believe, it's about what you actually do with that belief. You can say God is love all day long, but what if that belief alone isn't enough to save you? Because Jesus didn't just say believe, he said follow. And that one word changes everything. It means action. It means obedience. It means choosing a path, even when it's inconvenient, uncomfortable, or completely against the culture around you. And that's exactly where most people start to slip. Not because they reject God outright, but because they slowly stop prioritizing him. And once that happens, something else quietly takes his place. Now here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because when asked directly whether only a few people will actually be saved, the answer wasn't softened, reworded, or diluted. It was direct. If Jesus said it, then it's true. Many are called, but few are chosen. That's not poetic language. That's a warning. And the deeper you think about it, the more unsettling it becomes, because it forces a question most people avoid. What does it actually mean to be chosen? At first, you might think it's about being special or selected or somehow favored. But that's not what was being described at all. Being chosen isn't passive. It's not something that just happens to you. It's something you respond to, something you cooperate with. Grace is given freely, but your response to that grace determines everything that comes next. And here's the tension. Because if grace is available to everyone, then why aren't more people living like it matters? The answer isn't complicated, but it is uncomfortable. Because living as a true disciple doesn't just mean agreeing with Jesus, it means aligning your life with him completely. And that's where the numbers start to shrink. Because believing is easy, following is costly, and most people, even those who call themselves religious, stop somewhere in between. Think about that for a second. What does it mean if entire groups of people claim faith but don't live it? What does it mean if the very people who are supposed to know better don't act like it matters? Because according to what was said, even within the church itself, a massive number of people aren't doing the most basic thing they were asked to do. And if that's true, then the problem isn't outside, it's inside. And that's where this stops being theoretical and starts becoming personal. Because it's easy to look at the world and say it's broken, but it's much harder to look at your own life and ask whether you're actually living the truth you claim to believe. And if you're not, then the next question becomes even harder. What are you risking by staying where you are? But before you answer that, something even more unsettling emerges from the conversation. Because the danger isn't just about neglect, it's also about deception, and not the kind you'd expect. Because one of the most disturbing patterns that keeps showing up is people believing they're fine when they're not. There's this quiet assumption that as long as you're a good person, everything will work out. That God understands, that he'll make exceptions, that somehow the rules don't fully apply to you. And at first glance, that sounds comforting. It feels compassionate. It feels reasonable. But what if that assumption is exactly what's leading people away from the truth instead of toward it? Because yes, God is love. That part is real. But love doesn't erase truth. And it doesn't remove the standards that were clearly given. And that's where the illusion begins to crack. Because if you accept one part of the message but ignore the rest, are you actually following it at all? Now here's where things take a turn. Because the conversation didn't just stay at the level of general beliefs, it moved into real lives, real situations where these ideas aren't theoretical anymore, they're painfully concrete. Like the story of a marriage that looked perfect on the outside, two people deeply formed in their faith, families committed to living it out, everything aligned, or at least it seemed that way. But then something happened that no one expected. Without warning, without confrontation, one spouse filed for divorce in secret, and just like that, everything collapsed. At first, it looks like a personal tragedy, miscommunication, emotional distance, maybe even betrayal. But then something deeper emerges, because when the church examined the marriage, it declared something shocking. Not that the marriage ended, but that it was never valid in the first place. Think about what that means. A relationship that looked real, felt real, produced children, and yet sacramentally, it never existed. That raises a question most people never consider. How many things in life look solid on the surface, but aren't actually grounded in truth underneath? Because if something as serious as a marriage can appear legitimate and still be invalid at its core, then what about other areas of life? What about your beliefs, your habits, your spiritual state? What if some of the things you trust most aren't as secure as you think? And just when you start to process that, the conversation shifts again, this time into something even more unsettling, because it's not just about what's valid or invalid, it's about what's influencing you, often without you realizing it. Because there are people, real people, who experience things they can't explain, thoughts that don't feel like their own, disturbances that don't follow any logical pattern. And the immediate reaction in modern culture is to dismiss it, label it, explain it away. But what if not everything fits neatly into those categories? Now be careful here, because jumping to conclusions can be just as dangerous as ignoring reality. Not everything is spiritual. Some things are psychological. Some things are environmental. But what if some things aren't? That's where discernment becomes critical, and where most people feel completely unprepared. Because how do you tell the difference between a mental struggle and something spiritual? How do you know when you're dealing with stress and when you're dealing with something deeper? And more importantly, what do you do about it? The advice given wasn't dramatic, it wasn't sensational, but it was very specific. Return to the basics. Confession, renunciation, verbal rejection of anything connected to darkness. And then something most people overlook: speaking your faith out loud. Not thinking it, not assuming it, saying it. Because there's something about declaring truth that changes the environment around you, and whether you understand why or not, the effect is real. But here's where it gets even more intense. Because sometimes the issue isn't just personal, it's attached to places, environments, even objects. And that idea alone makes a lot of people uncomfortable, because it suggests that what you surround yourself with matters more than you think. And that leads to a question that most people never ask. What have you allowed into your life without realizing its impact? Because once something is invited in, even unintentionally, it doesn't always leave on its own. And suddenly, the conversation isn't just about faith anymore, it's about influence. It's about access. It's about authority and who actually has it. But before you can even process that, another layer unfolds, one that challenges something even more fundamental: your understanding of suffering, failure, and whether you might be under something you can't see. Because what happens when someone looks at their entire life and all they see is struggle, repeated failure, broken relationships, missed opportunities, and no clear explanation why? At what point does a person start to wonder, is this just bad luck or something more? And that's exactly what one caller asked, not casually, but from a place of deep frustration. After years of trying and failing again and again, people around her had already started offering explanations, whispers of curses, suggestions that something unseen might be working against her. And here's where things get dangerous, because when life stops making sense, the mind starts searching for answers, any answers. But not every explanation is true, and not every struggle is spiritual warfare. So how do you tell the difference? The response was grounded, almost unexpectedly so. Being single, being unsuccessful, facing hardship, none of that automatically means you're cursed. That's not how it works. But at the same time, the possibility of spiritual influence wasn't completely dismissed either. Instead, something much more balanced was offered. If there is something there, it can be broken. And that changes everything, because it means you're not stuck. It means you're not powerless. But it also means you have to take responsibility to act, to engage, instead of just assuming things will fix themselves. And that's where most people hesitate, because taking action means confronting things you'd rather ignore. But what if ignoring them is exactly what's keeping you trapped? And just when you think you've reached the edge of this conversation, it goes even further into something that forces you to rethink everything you thought you understood about life, death, and what happens after. Because if everything you've heard so far is true, then the next part becomes unavoidable. What actually happens to the people we lose? And more importantly, what can you still do for them after they're gone? That's where the story takes another turn, one that most people aren't ready for, but once you hear it, you won't be able to ignore it. Because once the conversation shifts from life to death, something in the tone changes completely. It stops being theoretical, it stops being abstract, and suddenly it becomes personal in a way most people don't want to sit with for very long. Because the question isn't just what happens when we die, the question becomes what can still be done after we die. And according to Father Dan Reehil, that answer is not nothing. Because one of the most repeated ideas in this entire conversation is that death is not the end of relationship, it's the beginning of accountability. And that idea changes how you look at everything that comes before it. Because if the soul continues, then love continues, and responsibility continues, and prayer continues. That's where something like Mass suddenly becomes more than a weekly obligation. It becomes something closer to a lifeline, not just for the living, but for the dead as well. Because when someone passes away, especially in painful or sudden circumstances, the Church doesn't describe them as simply gone. It describes a process, a purification, a reality that most people barely think about until they're forced to. And that's where the idea of offering Mass for the deceased becomes central. Because in this worldview, prayer is not symbolic. It is active. It reaches. It applies. It participates in something larger than what we can see. So when a caller speaks about losing a brother to a fentanyl overdose, the response doesn't stay in grief alone. It moves into action. Mass, prayer, offering, intercession. Not as comfort only, but as participation in something ongoing. Because what if the story of a life doesn't end at the moment of death, but continues in a state where help is still possible? That question alone is enough to shift how someone processes grief forever. But then the conversation takes another turn, because once you accept that the spiritual world continues beyond death, you start to ask what else might be active in it right now. And that's where things like spiritual oppression, curses, and unseen influence enter the discussion. Not as entertainment, not as horror stories, but as lived experiences people are struggling to understand. And here's where the tension begins to build again. Because on one hand, not everything is spiritual. Not every struggle has a supernatural cause. But on the other hand, dismissing everything as just psychological can blind you to something deeper. So The real question becomes not, is this real or not, but how do I discern what is actually happening? That's where confession reappears, not as ritual, but as reset, a clearing, a return. Because in this framework, spiritual clarity doesn't come from analyzing everything endlessly. It comes from realignment. And realignment always begins with truth. Truth spoken, truth confessed, truth renounced. Especially when the past includes things people often try to bury: occult involvement, spiritual experimentation, practices that seemed harmless at the time but left deeper consequences than expected. Because one of the most unsettling themes in the conversation is this idea: not everything you invite into your life announces itself clearly when it arrives. Sometimes it comes disguised as curiosity, sometimes as healing, sometimes as peace, and only later does it become something heavier, something harder to name. That's why the advice isn't fear-based, it's corrective. Go back, confess, renounce, close the door. Not because fear is the goal, but because freedom is. And then something very important is added. Something most people overlook when they think about spiritual struggle. Authority matters. Not emotional intensity, not dramatic experiences, authority. Because in moments of confusion, people tend to rely on feelings. But in this worldview, feelings are not the foundation of discernment. Faith is. Sacramental life is. Alignment with God is. And that's where practices like blessing a home come into the conversation, not as superstition, but as intentional declaration, a way of reclaiming what is yours under God's authority. And suddenly, everyday objects begin to carry meaning people don't normally assign to them. A house, a room, a piece of paper, a digital file, even something as simple as stored material on a computer tied to past spiritual practices. The instruction is not to analyze it endlessly, but to remove it, delete it, burn it, confess it, close it. Because the goal is not to keep engaging with what pulls you backward, but to move forward without it still attached. And that's where another major theme emerges: generational patterns. Because when people start describing repeated suffering across families, repeated loss, repeated addiction, repeated tragedy, the human mind naturally starts looking for explanations. Coincidence? Environment? Genetics? Trauma? All of those matter. But in some cases, people begin to wonder if there is something deeper running through family history that cannot be explained purely in natural terms. And that's where the idea of generational curses enters the conversation. Not as a diagnosis, not as a certainty, but as a possibility that requires discernment. Because if patterns repeat across generations, then the question becomes whether something has been opened, inherited, or never addressed at a deeper level. And the response is careful, not sensational. If something like that exists, it is not unstoppable. It is not final. It is not beyond authority. It can be addressed through prayer, through renunciation, through structured spiritual intervention, through what the tradition describes as breaking agreements made in the past, even if those agreements were made by people long gone. And that idea introduces something even more important. You are not powerless in your present just because of your past, but you also cannot ignore the need to confront it, because avoidance doesn't break cycles. It preserves them. And that's where deliverance prayers and structured spiritual practices are mentioned again, not as dramatic rituals, but as disciplined acts of correction. The emphasis is always the same. Bring it into the light. Don't leave it hidden. Don't leave it unresolved. Because unresolved things don't disappear. They repeat. Then the conversation shifts again, and this time it moves into something even more sensitive: possession and oppression. A mother calls in, worried about her son, addiction, alcohol, emotional distress, and something deeper that she cannot quite define but feels intensely real. And here the response refuses to simplify it too quickly. Because not every struggle is possession. Not every addiction is spiritual warfare and isolation. But at the same time, suffering is not meaningless. So the guidance becomes layered, practical and spiritual at the same time. Pray, speak truth, encourage direct relationship with God, remove secrecy. Stop hiding the struggle in symbolic gestures alone and move toward direct engagement. Because the most dangerous place someone can be is isolated inside their struggle. And then comes a line that quietly reframes everything. You've tried everything else. Why not try God directly? Not as a last resort in desperation, but as the most logical starting point. Because if faith is real, then it is not supplementary. It is foundational. And that leads into something even more confronting. Because belief is not the same as engagement. A person can grow up surrounded by religion, attend religious education, know the language, and still remain distant from actual lived faith. And distance creates vulnerability, not necessarily in a dramatic way, but in a gradual way. A slow weakening of internal structure, a loss of clarity about meaning, purpose, identity. And that's where addiction, despair, and confusion often find space to grow. But even here, the message is not hopeless, because the solution is not complexity, it is return. Return to prayer, return to confession, return to sacramental life, return to what was there before everything became complicated. And then something unexpected enters the conversation again, something physical, objects of devotion, medals, scapulars, blessings. The idea that tangible things can serve as reminders and reinforcements of spiritual reality. Not because the object itself has power, but because it connects the person to something larger than themselves. And suddenly, something like the miraculous medal or the scapular is not just symbolic, it becomes part of a lived system of constant orientation back toward faith, not fear, orientation. And that distinction matters. Because fear isolates, but orientation directs. And throughout the entire conversation, that is the underlying shift happening again and again, from confusion to clarity, from isolation to structure, from assumption to action. But just when it feels like everything is settling into place, another layer appears underneath it all. Because even after confession, even after prayer, even after returning to faith, people still face resistance. Still face struggle, still face uncertainty. And that raises the final question that no one can avoid forever. If you return, why does the battle continue? And the answer, hinted but never fully resolved in this conversation, is that return is not the end of conflict. It is the beginning of awareness. Because once you see clearly, you cannot unsee what is there. And that awareness changes how you interpret everything, your thoughts, your fears, your patterns, your relationships, your suffering, your peace. And that is where the conversation leaves you hanging, not with resolution, but with something more uncomfortable. Clarity doesn't always make life easier. Sometimes it makes it more real. And once something becomes real, you can no longer afford to ignore it, because what comes next is no longer about explanation. It's about response. And that's where the story stops. For now. There's a point in every conversation like this where the questions stop sounding like curiosity and start sounding like something heavier. Not because the answers changed, but because the listener did. And once you've heard enough to start reevaluating your own life instead of just observing others, the tone of everything shifts. Because now it's not about those people anymore. It's about you. And that's where everything in this final stretch begins to converge. Because the conversation has moved through marriage, salvation, curses, addiction, spiritual struggle, and even the unseen weight of generational patterns. But underneath all of it, one question keeps resurfacing in different forms. What actually determines where a soul ends up? And what changes the direction of a life before it's too late? That question is what quietly ties everything together in the teaching of Father Dan Reehil throughout this discussion, because nothing here is presented as random, not suffering, not struggle, not even silence. Everything is framed as something that either pulls a person closer to God or slowly detaches them from him without them noticing it happening. And that's where the most uncomfortable idea returns again. Because when asked whether many or few will be saved, the answer doesn't soften with time or distance. It stays direct. Not everyone who assumes they are fine is actually aligned with the life they are called to live. And that gap between assumption and reality is where the danger quietly grows. But here's the part people miss when they hear that. It's not meant to produce panic. It's meant to produce attention, because panic freezes you, but attention changes you. And the difference between those two reactions is everything. So the real issue isn't just, will few be saved? The real issue is, what kind of life leads a person into that small group in the first place? And the answer, repeated in different forms throughout this entire conversation, always circles back to one thing: active relationship, not passive identity. You can inherit a faith, you can be raised in it, you can even defend it intellectually, but none of that replaces participation. And participation in this context is not abstract. It is lived. It shows up in habits, in choices, in obedience, in what you prioritize when no one is watching. That's why something as simple as Mass is repeatedly treated as more than a routine, because it isn't just about attendance. It's about orientation. It's about placing your life back in alignment with something higher than your immediate emotions or circumstances. And that's where the warning begins to sharpen again, because the further a person drifts from that alignment, the more they start to interpret life through confusion instead of clarity. And confusion, when left unchecked, becomes a kind of background noise that slowly reshapes everything. What used to feel obvious becomes questionable. What used to feel wrong becomes normal. And what used to feel spiritually significant becomes optional. That's how drift happens. Not in dramatic rebellion, but in gradual reinterpretation. And once reinterpretation becomes your default mode, even truth starts to feel negotiable. That's why the call back to confession and sacramental life appears so often in this discussion. Not because people are expected to be perfect, but because they are expected to stay realigned. Because without that realignment, something else begins to fill the space. And that something else is rarely obvious at first. Sometimes it looks like distraction. Sometimes it looks like exhaustion. Sometimes it looks like personality. But over time, it becomes something deeper. A life lived slightly out of alignment, without the awareness that anything has shifted at all. And that's where the spiritual dimension becomes relevant again in a way people don't expect. Because when people in this conversation describe experiences, they cannot explain fear, disturbance, patterns of oppression, or repeated internal struggle. The response is not to dramatize it, but to reframe it. Not everything is supernatural, but not everything is purely psychological either. And the point isn't to force an explanation. The point is to restore clarity about response. Because regardless of origin, the response remains consistent. Return, renounce what pulls you away, and reestablish spiritual order. And that's where something important happens. Because notice what is not emphasized. Not obsession, not constant analysis, not chasing hidden meanings in every event. Instead, the focus is action, confession, prayer, blessing, renunciation, participation in the life of the church. And that simplicity is intentional, because complexity without direction doesn't heal anyone, but clarity with action does. And that leads into another thread that quietly runs through everything discussed. Authority, not personal power, not emotional intensity, but spiritual authority grounded in relationship with God. That's why practices like blessing a home or praying over a family are described not as rituals of control, but as declarations of alignment. You are not trying to dominate unseen forces. You are restoring order in your immediate space under God's authority. And that distinction is critical, because when people lose that distinction, fear starts to replace faith. And fear always overcomplicates what faith simplifies. Now, at this point, the conversation begins to circle back to something that was mentioned earlier but never fully explored. Patterns across families, loss, addiction, repetition of tragedy, cycles that seem to repeat without explanation. And this is where the idea of generational influence becomes most sensitive. Because when people see repetition, they instinctively look for cause. And sometimes that cause is psychological, sometimes it's environmental, sometimes it's behavioral inheritance. But sometimes within the theological framework being discussed, it is treated as something that requires spiritual interruption rather than just analysis. Not because the past defines the present, but because unresolved spiritual history is believed to continue influencing the present until it is addressed, and the response to that is never presented as fear-based. It is always presented as interruptible, breakable, addressable. That is the consistent message. Nothing here is irreversible if it is brought into truth. But what cannot be ignored is this: avoidance preserves cycles. Engagement disrupts them. And that's where personal responsibility becomes unavoidable again. Because at some point, you stop being just someone who hears about these ideas, and you become someone who has to decide what to do with them. And that decision is where the conversation quietly turns inward. Because it is one thing to hear about salvation in general terms. It is another thing entirely to ask whether your current life is actually oriented toward it. And that is where the earlier statement about many are called, but few are chosen returns with its full weight. Because if calling is widespread, then the difference is not access. The difference is response. And response always shows up in how you live when no one is forcing you to choose. That is where truth becomes visible. Not in moments of discussion, but in moments of decision. And that brings everything full circle. Because the warning that began this entire conversation was never just about fear of loss. It was about urgency of awareness. Awareness that spiritual life is not static. It either deepens or it fades. And it rarely announces when it is fading. It simply becomes less central over time until one day it feels optional. And by then, the drift has already happened. But here is the part that changes the tone of everything. Because nothing in this entire conversation is presented as final condemnation, not struggle, not past involvement, not failure, not even distance. Everything, repeatedly, is framed with one underlying possibility: return. Return is always available, but it is never passive. It requires movement. It requires decision. It requires letting go of what keeps you suspended between awareness and action. And that is why even the most difficult topics in this conversation, death, addiction, spiritual struggle, fear, confusion, are always redirected back to something simple enough to ignore, but powerful enough to change a life. Come back, realign, participate, not in theory, in practice, because in the end, that is where everything either collapses or begins to rebuild. And that is where this entire message leaves you, not with all the answers fully laid out, but with a question that refuses to stay external anymore. If what you heard is even partially true, then what part of your life has been waiting for you to finally respond? And that is where the story ends. Not as information, but as invitation. At this point, something subtle changes in the weight of the entire conversation. It stops feeling like isolated stories from callers and starts feeling like one continuous thread, different lives, different problems, but the same underlying tension running through all of them. Something unseen shaping outcomes more than people realize, and most people only noticing it once things have already started to fall apart. And that's where the final layer begins to surface. Because once you've followed the discussion through marriage breakdowns, spiritual confusion, addiction, fear, generational suffering, and the question of salvation itself, there's one thing left that hasn't been fully confronted yet. Not what happens to other people, but what happens when you realize none of this is abstract anymore. It becomes personal. And that shift is exactly what the teaching of Father Dan Reehil keeps circling back to in different forms. Faith is not a background identity, it is a lived direction. And direction always implies movement towards something or away from it. There is no neutral standing still. And that idea becomes unavoidable as the conversation continues. Because when people call in, they are not just asking theological questions. They are trying to understand patterns in their lives that no longer make sense through ordinary explanations. A marriage that collapses unexpectedly, a son lost to addiction, a lifetime of struggle that seems disproportionate to effort, a sense of unseen pressure they can't name but can't ignore either. And in each case, the response does not reduce everything to one cause. Instead, it reframes the question entirely. Not why is this happening to me, but what am I doing with what is happening to me? And that distinction changes everything, because one keeps you analyzing, the other forces you to respond. And response is where spiritual life becomes real. That's why throughout the entire conversation, the repeated emphasis is not on explanation alone, but on action, confession, prayer, renunciation, participation in Mass, blessing one's home, returning to sacramental life, and rebuilding alignment step by step, because in this framework, clarity without action is incomplete. It's awareness without transformation, and awareness without transformation eventually turns into frustration. That's where many of the callers are standing without realizing it. They are aware something is wrong, but they are still searching for explanations that don't require immediate change. They want to understand first and act later. But the structure of the teaching keeps reversing that order. Act first. Clarity follows. And that reversal is where resistance often appears, because action implies surrender of control. And surrender of control is exactly what most people avoid when their lives feel unstable. But instability in this conversation is not treated as random. It is treated as something that demands recentering, not emotional recentering, spiritual recentering. And that's where practices that seem simple on the surface take on deeper meaning. Going back to Mass, receiving confession, praying consistently, speaking faith aloud, removing anything tied to past spiritual confusion, not because objects or memories have power in themselves, but because attachment to them keeps the mind divided. And division, over time, weakens clarity. That's the pattern that keeps appearing in different forms. A divided interior life leads to instability, and instability eventually expresses itself outwardly through relationships, choices, emotions, and sometimes suffering that feels difficult to explain. But even here, the message is not fatalistic, because every part of the structure being described assumes one constant truth. Restoration is always possible. Not immediate perfection, not instant resolution, but restoration. And restoration always begins with turning back. That's why even in conversations about spiritual struggle, fear is not the final tone. Direction is. Because fear says something is wrong and there is no way out. Direction says something is wrong and you now know where to move. And that distinction matters more than it first appears, because one paralyzes, the other initiates change. Now, as the conversation reaches its final phase, another theme quietly comes forward: endurance. Because once someone begins returning to faith in a serious way, the expectation is often that everything will immediately improve. That clarity will remove struggle. That alignment will eliminate difficulty. But what is repeatedly implied here is different. Alignment does not remove battle, it changes how the battle is understood. Struggle does not disappear, it becomes interpretable instead of chaotic. And that means something important. Continued difficulty is not necessarily evidence of absence. It can be part of ongoing formation. That idea reframes suffering entirely, not as meaningless, not as proof of abandonment, but as something that can exist even within a life that is actively returning. And that prevents a dangerous misunderstanding that progress should always feel like comfort. In reality, progress often feels like resistance before it feels like peace, because anything being reordered internally will first create friction with what was previously normal. And that friction is often where people assume something is going wrong, when in fact something is being restructured. That's why persistence becomes central. Not emotional persistence alone, but disciplined persistence. Continuing practices even when feelings fluctuate. Continuing prayer even when clarity feels distant. Continuing participation even when understanding is incomplete. Because in this framework, stability is built through repetition, not insight alone. And repetition gradually reshapes perception, which means over time, what once felt uncertain begins to feel grounded again. But the key point that ties everything together is this. Nothing meaningful in this conversation is presented as automatic. Not salvation, not healing, not deliverance from struggle, not restoration of peace. Everything is relational, responsive, and ongoing. And that means every listener is implicitly placed into the same position as every caller at a point of decision. Not a one-time decision only, but a repeated one. Because every day becomes another moment of either alignment or drift. And that's where the final tension rests. Not in fear, not in speculation, but in awareness. Because once you see the structure being described across all these stories, marriage, addiction, loss, spiritual confusion, generational patterns, and salvation itself, it becomes difficult to unsee the underlying message. Life is not spiritually neutral. It is directional. And direction is shaped by what you consistently return to. Which means the real question is no longer about what happened to other people in these stories. It becomes, what are you consistently returning to in your own life without realizing where it is taking you? And that question is where everything finally settles. Not as an answer, but as a mirror. And what you do with it next is where the real story begins.